Now? How about now? Ooh, now it works. We have a few quick announcements that we'll make before we get into our study this evening. There's a few that we need to be mindful of and be praying for. I know one that has been added, and I'm probably going to butcher this. It is Juanya Young. That is a sister-in-law to Evelyn Kirby, and related to quite a few people in the congregation through that. She is in Franklin, Indiana, and has been diagnosed with cancer. Is struggling with that. So we'll keep her and that family in our prayers. Then Ashley Schaus, her surgery that was supposed to be tomorrow has been postponed for a few months. So we'll keep that in our prayers. Johnny Combs is back at home. Elizabeth Hoffman is in Gallatin Hospital with a bad infection. And then Robert Fields is up here locally in Macon Community Hospital. He was found yesterday evening and taken to the hospital. And this morning when I went up there, they were running about every test that they could run, trying to figure out exactly what it was. I believe he lost consciousness and fell in his home. I'll have to call back up in the morning. I would assume at this point they've already diagnosed and figured out exactly what it was, what the cause was. But when I was there this morning, they were still running tests on him. So we'll keep Mr. Robert in our prayers. Eddie Osbrooks, that is Melinda's son-in-law. The cancer treatments are not going well. The brother of Melinda Sewell's son-in-law, the treatments aren't going well. Then Martha Doss, as she's continuing to have shoulder pain issues. Alma Clark, that's Roxy Sutton's sister, has thyroid cancer. And then Christopher Nichols, that's the grandson of Miss Janice Nichols, has also been diagnosed with cancer. I know there's quite a few others that are very recent that we've mentioned in the last few weeks, but just with how long the list was from last week to this week, I'll stick with just those. Are there any others that y'all want to update or give info on for the sick list? Okay. Johnny and Brenda are... Okay. Thank you for checking in on him. Yes, Jeff Thompson. I know, and you said that he has had a stroke because we mentioned him for a heart attack either a week ago or a couple weeks ago. Open heart surgery, that was it, and now has had a stroke. Okay. Gotcha. Then we want to mention Kermis West, the family of Kermis West. That's Larry West's father as he passed away. And then the family of Robbie Jones as she passed away on December 12th. And so her services will be in Gainsboro at Anderson Funeral Home. Visitations Thursday, so tomorrow from 4 to 8. And funeral will be Friday at 1. I think that sympathy to the family of Scott Gann as well. That's another one. Do y'all have any others that I may have missed? I know it was a long list. That was a lot for us to be praying for. Okay. If there isn't anything else, we'll open up with a okay. We'll open up with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our study. If you would, let's pray. Lord, help us to have our minds right and have our hearts right going into this evening and this time of being in your Word. The days, especially when they get dark like this so quickly, Lord, they can feel really long. And so we ask for just encouragement and rejuvenation that comes from you and comes from your Word that we can't find anywhere else in this world. And we ask that we can leave here rekindled to spend the rest of our week trying to serve you and trying to show others to you. We mentioned a very long list of names, some that are in our church family, some that are relatives of church family, some that are just friends and members of the community that are struggling and hurting. There were a whole a good portion of our list, Lord, that have recently received news that is tragic news when it comes to cancer. We have such a soft spot when it comes to that, as we have so many friends and family and loved ones that have struggled with that very illness, and we need your help and your comfort and your hand, and we ask for peace in each of those situations. We are grateful for our families this time of year. Please watch over them and keep them safe. Help us to be the examples for them that we want to be and that you call us to be and need for us to be. And we again ask for your hand and your blessings on this moment of study. We ask for your forgiveness, and may we give forgiveness as freely as we have received it from you. We pray all this in Jesus. Amen. Okay, if you want to, go ahead and turn over to 2 Chronicles 24. 2 Chronicles 24. And while you're turning there, you might not know that it is a very special day. And the reason that it's a very special day, it's because it's my favorite secretary's birthday. And so this is a picture of me and Mary Lou from a few years back. It was taken together at the same place at the same time, me and her and the dog. And so I definitely want to wish her a happy birthday. I don't want to leave anybody out, but if you put up with me in the office every day for 4.5 years, then I'll make you a birthday slide too. The trade-off's not worth it. Putting up with me is not worth just a birthday slide. But anyway, so appreciate her. But 2 Chronicles chapter 24 is where we're going to study from tonight. And as you're turning there, I know that we have to kind of get our bearings before we just dive straight into the text and start reading it, because one of the things about the Old Testament is you can turn just a few pages away, just a few chapters or even a book or two away, and be in an entirely different millennia. You could be in an entirely different part of the world. And so it's important, I think, when we're entering into a passage like this, to ask a few big questions about maybe where we're at in the grand scheme of the Bible, where we're at in history, to better understand it and better get our bearings. So going into 2 Chronicles chapter 24, what can you notice kind of right off the bat to help give us a timestamp of where we are in the good book? It's a very specific thing that's used all throughout Scripture. It's right in front of you. What does it tell you at the beginning of chapter 24? Okay, so it tells you who's the king, and I think that's one of the main things that we look for throughout the Old Testament, throughout the prophets, is it is time stamping itself by telling you who's reigning, and it's time stamping itself by telling us who is in control. So I'm not sure if you keep this or not. You don't have to, but I keep it because I put a lot into making it, so I might as well. But if you have this little thing in the front of your Bibles, if not, I can get you one. I immediately go to it to get my timestamp of where I'm at. And so there's little Joash right there, and he's even got the thumbs up next to him, so we already know that he's going to be, a good king. And we look over out to the side and see a couple different things. One is that the corresponding passage to go along with 2 Chronicles 24 is 2 Kings 11 through 12, so they talk about the same thing. And then two, I get the timestamp of whereabouts we're at in history. Is it looks like we're getting towards the turn of the century, from the 9th century into the 8th century, from the 800s into the 700s. And so that gives us a grasp of grand scheme if Saul is at the top and if, Jesus, 4 BC, is at the bottom. Where are we in Israel's history? Oh no, that's not good. That didn't help y'all at all, did it? I can see it. I can see it just fine on this screen. I don't know. Okay. Did that work? No. I tried. I shot my shot. See, for me to be this young, I should be better with technology than what I am. But I'm afraid if I projected, hold on, let's see. For all the people that are hoping I get this right so we can move on with class. I wonder if that'll do it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it or not, but we'll try it like this. Ta-da! You still can't read it. That's so far away, you have no idea what's on there. Okay. Well, anyway, if you do have that little chart, I would encourage you to reference it whenever you see the reign we're in, the king we're in, the prophet we're in, because it gives you a timestamp, a bearing. None of Scripture is meant to be read and isolated like in a vacuum. Like we are meant to read it in the big picture of the story. Where does this fit and where does this tie in with everything else? So the first thing that I notice is we are in kind of the middle of the divided kingdom, and the middle means that they're at a point of prosperity and they haven't yet hit their fall. They haven't yet hit the downhill stretch going into Babylonian captivity. And so that gives us a great idea of what's going on. Kind of where the mindset and spiritual state of Israel is. They're very sinful, but yet they haven't had that reckoning yet of God's judgment. And you also notice, if you have that little chart and are looking at it, you'll realize that we're not to the heat of the prophets yet. Like if you're using that you got a year ago that I passed out in class, that you don't have prophets in southern Judah preaching yet. Written prophets, at least. We're about to read of some prophets preaching. But as far as like the early on prophets like Micah or Isaiah that preached to the southern tribes, they're not on the scene yet, which is big for us to know as well. So getting into chapter 24, once we have our bearings of where we are in history and among the other kings, the other prophets, and can kind of put it in its place, we enter into the text. And so I'll ask this first question because it is on there. We look back at the end of chapter 23, which is a gateway into chapter 24, and we have our good friend Jehoiada, and he has some reforms. If you could help me walk through verses 16 through 21 and tell me what some of the things that Jehoiada the priest does in his time of leading God's people spiritually. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a huge one. They tear down the houses of Baal. So he is a priest that comes in and takes out idol worship and removes idol worship from Israel. Okay, so that puts them on a path to being God-fearing again when they're being tempted to worship idols like other nations. What else? In verses 16 through 21. Of chapter 23. Yeah, so he posts watchmen outside the house of the Lord for a couple different reasons. I think one of them is to ensure that all of the offerings that are organized are carried out. And then you also go down into verse 19 and you realize that apparently there was a problem with the Israelites trying to enter into the temple even though they were unclean, and that was against God's law. And so watchmen were posted. Not only did he tear down houses of Baal and places which would have just been places of idol worship, he also restores proper worship where God's people can not only come in and make those sacrifices, but you see that there is a really positive response from the people of Israel as they're praising, they're rejoicing, they're singing, all of the above. Okay, I think that gives us a pretty good idea of where Jehoiada's leadership has taken them spiritually. They're coming off of a really bad king, Athaliah, who's executed. And so we get into chapter 24, and we meet our good friend Joash. And that's the answer to the question, who enters the scene in chapter 24? That's Joash. But the reason why we have to talk about Jehoiada before we talk about Joash is in the first two verses of chapter 24. If somebody would please read them.
Joash the
Perfect. And then it goes on in verse 3 to say Jehoiada acquired 2 wives for him. But nevertheless, it's important, I think, for us to realize what's the outstanding fact that was just read in the first 2 verses about King Joash. He's only 7. Like, you might not remember his name, but you might have remembered learning of the story of the king that was 7, right? So what makes Jehoiada so important to Joash in this story? Yeah, he's a mentor. Imagine, I think, maybe how helpless or out of control even the most mature of 7-year-olds would be in a position of authority. And so you have Jehoiada that comes in and is able as priest to, I believe, give him the proper guidance that he needs early on. And whenever we start to look at the way that proves to be good for God, and I think it almost trains up Joash in the way that he's going to go. Because you notice that it says that he did all what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But we're going to finish that story out because that verse has a little asterisk next to it. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord all of the days of Jehoiada, but Jehoiada dies. And so let's watch kind of that process and walk through how Joash was faithful, and then how all of that kind of changed. So walking with me through chapter 24, what does Joash do? He decides, to restore the house of the Lord. And so he wants to maybe bring it back to its former glory. Keep in mind, when we talk about the former glory of the temple, we're talking about, I would say, the completion of the temple. When Solomon first built it was probably the moment that it was at its height and at its peak. And so if you wanted to go through, I guess that would be like 1 Kings 6, 7, somewhere in there, maybe 5. You have the description and the consummation of the temple, and it's described like it's one of the, if it was still standing, it would be one of the ancient wonders of the world. Like, it was so extravagant. Like, everything was gold inlay, everything was silver inlay. It was beautiful, and so the temple is at its height. But keep in mind that the temple that worships a one and only God gets neglected when His people start leaving for idol worship. So they start building different places to worship these other gods, and the temple grows neglected. And so there's a need, I think, for restoration. So he takes it upon himself and makes it his mission to restore the house of the Lord. And the way that he goes about that, in verses 5 and following, he gathers priests and Levites together. And what does he ask for them to do? It's a few verses down, but take up a collection. That's the plan. Is that in order? Obviously, I don't know if you've ever renovated anything before, but it's not a cheap endeavor, is it? So whenever he has these plans, they're plans that have dollar signs attached to them, and so they take up a collection. Even your translation might say a tax of the people, which connects back to Moses, but. As they put out a proclamation in verse 9 that this tax is going to be taken up, it goes out, and it just has this positive, overwhelming blessing of God upon it. The way that they collected money. Look at the end of verse 11. So they had a chest where it was collected. Verse 11, and whenever the chest was brought to the king's officers by the Levites, when they saw that there was much money in it, the king's secretary and the officer of the chief priest would come and empty the chest and take it and return it to its place. Thus, they did day by day and collected money in abundance. And so that is kind of showing God's blessing and I think His approval on what Joash is trying to do. He's trying to bring a former glory back to worshiping God, focusing on God and God's temple. Now, looking at where I think all this starts to make its downturn, notice the verse, 14. And when they had finished, They brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, and with it were made utensils for the house of the Lord, both for the service and for burnt offerings, and dishes for incense, and vessels of gold and silver. They offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord regularly all the days of Jehoiada. And so it sounds like that phrase that they made out of them instead of they purchased with them, that like they took that very gold and silver and melted it down and used it to give the instruments needed to offer sacrifices in the temple. So Joash uses, I think, his position to put the people's focus back on the Lord and his house at that time. Granted, I know that we are in a different covenant, and granted, I know that we don't have a God that dwells in houses made with hands. But I do think it's really neat to look at a lot of the parallels that we can make today to even our lives and our faith. Like, for example, one just that stands out to me, that people will focus more on something that they're invested in and something that they have a part in, right? Imagine being one of those children of Israel that has poured into this offering and this collection for the temple to be restored. I think there was a feeling of ownership there because like they had a part in it and a hand in it, whether that be great or whether that be small. And so it might sound like really superficial to just be like, oh yeah, Old Testament story, they took a bunch of money, redid the temple, okay, let's all go home. But I think on a deeper level to that, this was like a mission, I think, that they were trying to fulfill, and it was a mission that everyone seemed to be taking pretty seriously because of how they were collecting, and they were doing so in abundance. So people were just going out of their way beyond themselves to give all for God's glory. And so when you look at kind of us transitioning into that today, I think that's one of the things that I really I see a lot of value in, and I try my best to emphasize in ministry is buy-in of people and investment of people. You know what I mean? That if somebody can feel like they have a true part and have a true investment in or have a true hand in something, I think they're going to be a lot more passionate about it than if they feel like, you know, it was something that somebody else did and they were just handed it. You know what I mean? So being able to open up opportunities for people to really take ownership of different ministries, different opportunities, I think is key. But anyway, it's a biblical concept. I think Joash is doing it right here in 2 Chronicles 24. But before we transition to the sad part of the story, do y'all have any thoughts or comments or questions or concerns? Anyone want to see Mary Lou's birthday picture again? No? Okay. All right, then we'll pick up and we'll continue in the text. Because keep in mind, somebody, if you would, reread for me verse 2, chapter 24, verse 2. And it's telling us from the beginning, right? He did what was right in all of the days of. And that's probably where we're going to spend the rest of tonight and really talk about, is that I think Joash's faithfulness was contingent upon Jehoiada being there to guide him. And when that guide wasn't there anymore, I don't know that Joash's faith had fully developed into his own. He was led away by others. So picking up in verse 17, you have this change. That's the slide changed, but what changes Joash and what's the consequence? Okay, we'll see that in verses 17. So you have the death of Jehoiada, and all of the priests of Judah, they came, they pay homage to the king. The king then listened to them and abandoned the house of the Lord, and consequently abandoned the God of their fathers, serving the Asherim and idols. Wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for all of this guilt of theirs. And then God sends them prophets in verse 19. Yet he sent prophets among them to bring them back to the Lord. These testified against them, but they would not pay attention. Okay, so we notice kind of what changes in Joash's life is his influences. You have a change from him listening to Jehoiada and to listening to these princes of Judah that want to transition back to worshiping idols again. And what kind of comes next, the end of the chapter ends with, I guess, two different main things happening. In verses 20 through 22, big moment in biblical history, Jesus references it. What happens in verses 20 to 22? Someone's killed. It's a prophet. Yeah, his son Zechariah is killed for being one of those prophets that God sent to try and show the people that you've messed up, like you've gotten off track. And so as he preaches this message of we'll go and I'll let you read it. It's a pretty short message. Thus says God, why do you break the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, He has forsaken you. And crazy thing, all throughout the Old Testament and even today, if somebody has a message presented that they don't like or that maybe puts them in a really difficult position, they often respond with hostility. And so that's no different than in the Old Testament. There was Zechariah, he steps up, he gives a message of condemnation. The people respond by conspiring against him, and then they killed him. They stoned him to death with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. And that, now granted, we don't have enough time. There is a beautiful study in there, a really beautiful study in there. Don't miss the little things in Scripture. Where was he stoned? Of the courtyard of the temple. Keep in mind, throughout Israel's history, every sacrifice to be sacrificed from the moment that the temple was built passed right through that same place. And so if we ever want to do a study of like biblical martyrs, I think that location's very important. And I think this is one of them. I think that Zechariah, as a prophet, died a very sacrificial death, preaching the Lord's word, proclaiming the Lord's word, and it brings him to his own death because God's people weren't ready to hear it, and God's people weren't ready to receive it. They were too entrenched in their own idolatry. So Zechariah is, and again, he's the way that he is murdered is also important as well. I think when I think of look at how harsh of a message that he preaches. Thus says God, why do you break the commandments of the Lord so you cannot prosper? Because you've forsaken the Lord, He has forsaken you. That's pretty harsh. And then I see him, consequently, in verse 21, being stoned with stones. Does anybody else in Scripture just come to mind when we read those two things? Yeah, me too. I don't know if you've ever read the message that Stephen gives to the Sadducees in Acts 6 and 7, but boy is it direct. It is as harsh as the harshest prophet you've ever read. I would encourage you to go read it. And so again, he puts out a message that was very ill received, and it was received with hostility, and he was stoned. So anyway, that is one of the consequences of Joash and him being influenced no longer by a godly influence, but by a worldly influence, as it costs Zechariah his life. And you also have this wasn't just a random prophet. Like this was his mentor's son. He was so far, I think, into his new little circle of influencers that he didn't even realize who he was harming, or he did, and he's very twisted, I guess. Like this was one of the people that I would go as far as to say raised you. You know, when you're coming into the kinghood at 7 years old, and this priest takes you under their wing, like I consider that part of his raising. And so he's more or less killing a brother, I think, from my perspective. And that kind of shows us the consequence of where maybe idolatry takes us or bad influences takes us. But this is not the end of the consequences. What are the other consequences for Joash at the end of the book? Yeah, Syria attacks them, and they don't just attack them. What do? Starts with a W, and it's the opposite of lose. Win. Y'all are great. Y'all are great at this game this evening. Like they don't just attack them, but they come out on top. Which it was uncharacteristic. It was a battle that I believe God's people should have won otherwise. But because of their rejection, notice that the end of verse 24, it's very clear that God executes his judgment on Joash through the Syrians. And then king of Damascus, it was the capital of Syria, so they're the same place. But anyway, as all of this is happening, you pick up in verse 25, and when they had departed from him, leaving him severely wounded, his servants conspired against him because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest, and they killed him on his bed, so he died. Yeah, I was just about to get there. I thought it was really neat. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tomb of the kings. And notice what that's supposed to be contrasted with earlier in the chapter. Look at like verses 16 or 17. Yeah. Yeah, and so if you look back at verses 16 or 17, you have the priest, Jehoiada, that because of how God-fearing and God-honoring he was, even though he wasn't a king, it was an honor for him to be buried in the city of David among the kings, right? But you have Joash, who had that role and title and responsibility, neglected it, didn't serve God, and so his consequence is, I've got to get my names straight. Jehoiada was given the honor of being buried somewhere that he didn't deserve because of his God-honoring. Joash, the exact opposite, forsook God, didn't honor God, and ended up buried in a place that he could have been and was almost demoted. So that kind of concludes, I think, the chapter. But let's talk about acceptance and rejection with the last few minutes that we have. And I'll start off with an easy one. What ways do you see it just in your life and in the world around us? Maybe it's with you, maybe it's with your kids, maybe it's with friends at work, I don't know. But it's very relevant to Joash because you see like the two polar ends of the spectrum. You see him literally taking up massive collections and restoring the temple and following in Jehoiada's, guidance and the guy that reformed and placed guards to make sure sacrifices and cleanness were all kept. And then the whole pendulum swings with one man's death, and he goes to offering to idols and sacrificing to Baals. So how do our influences impact what we accept and what we reject? What do y'all think? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're exactly right. And so he went, and that's we sometimes. That's a study that we could also do and probably should also do. Let's do that. We're gonna have after we're done with this study, we're gonna do a study of priests and the tabernacle, and then later the temple. But one of the things about priests is that given their lifestyle. And given the lifestyle that is more or less, I hate to say forced, but the lifestyle that's forced upon them is they really didn't have, I think, as many worldly distractions because like their living and their provisions came from the food that was brought and the animals that were brought and sacrificed. Like it wasn't like they were incredibly wealthy. Like, yes, they got to associate with the most beautiful, extravagant temple in the world, but it wasn't like it was their house, and they're holding the keys to the Bentley out front. So I think you have priests that in the best case scenario, this wasn't always the case, but in the best case scenario, their minds and their souls and their lives were consecrated to focus on what was most important, pleasing God. And so when there are people that are like that and have that mindset, they have a certain kind of influence. But then on the flip side, you have these princes that had a very different kind of lifestyle. Okay, so they were the ones with the house that, granted, it wouldn't have been as nice as the temple, but it would have been pretty nice, right? And they do have the keys to the Bentley out front. And so whenever they are living, I think, in that worldly cycle, it's really easy for them to get their focus mixed up, their priorities mixed up, and they don't make for good influences. Okay, any other thoughts when it comes to how our influences impact what we accept or what we reject? Because it ties right into the study. That the whole chapter is about Joash and who he's letting in and who he's keeping out. Mm-hmm.
It seems like, looking back, Jehoiada, may have been somewhat of a mentor. It was almost like he was making the majority of the decisions. Because all the decisions that were being made were godly decisions on his word. And then when he passes on, then comes the ones that are more worried about, we collect God's money that's sitting on the temple, you're not doing it for yourself. So, they kind of come in and shifted his focus.
Mm-hmm.
If you go a little bit ahead in the future, you've got one of my favorites, Josiah.
Mm-hmm.
8 years old, only a year older, and he doesn't make the same mistakes.
You're right. Yeah.
And the Bible says that from the beginning of time to the end, and then since on Josiah, that there hadn't been any as good as him in the sight of the Lord.
Mm.
So there hadn't been any that was after. That puts him up, even though he was only 8 years old when he became king. The way 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles talks about him and refers to him actually says, and it seems that God looked more upon him than he did on David.
That would be a neat study. I do know that when we look at the reforms that Josiah made, that there, and we could get into some prophets and kind of show you where all this plays out. It was painful, I think, for the Lord. And stick with me on this thought because it's going to sound weird at first, but then it's going to make sense. It was almost painful to watch how devoted his people were turning back to him under Josiah, because the dominoes were already falling and the wheels were already turning for God's judgment to come through Babylon. But Josiah ushered in like the most devout period of Israel worshiping God in the end of the tail end of the kings. And so, also another neat thing to notice is we have it in both of these cases, and we also have it with the young man David that is taken in and placed as king. It seems that for whatever reason, that some of the best kings of God's people and the best leaders of God's people are really young in, I think, the beginning of their relationship with God, and they're really young in the beginning of their responsibility to God. And so maybe it is not a bad idea for us to take precedent from that and give little ones spiritual responsibility. Like now, obviously, I'm not saying, pick me out an 8-year-old. They're preaching next week. But what I am saying is that their faiths do matter. And I think the quicker that we can put them in a role of pleasing God in little ways, the more that's going to lead to them pleasing God in bigger ways. But what we sometimes default to is, well, you'll start talking about that stuff, when you get into junior high and high school. Let's sing this VBS song. Like you'll get there eventually. When in all reality, I think I see God working and using and bringing glory to Him and His kingdom through young ones, through little ones. But any other thoughts on that? Yeah, maybe so. I would say so. That one learned from the mistakes of the other, and keep in mind you have there is a almost history component to being a king. We can look at different passages that command kings to write and copy the book of the law, like to have their own copy of the book of the law that they've copied themselves. And so, granted, that might not fully extend into the history of writing down what other kings have done, but surely enough, I do believe that it's something he would have at the very least heard about. Okay. Here's what the last question I'll give you. Joash's faith required Jehoiada's guidance for it to stay strong. How does that speak to you today? Or maybe how does that apply to us today? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's something small, but I think it's an illustration of something much bigger for sure. So, peer pressure does influence us, right? Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah, don't stray too far from a support system, or don't stray at all. But don't stray too far from a godly support system. Yeah, choose godly people to give us guidance. Absolutely. But I think what I'll kind of also add to that and point out is if our faith is only devout and only strong when I've got the influence of this one person in my life, then maybe we don't have a whole lot of a faith to begin with. And that's a hard pill to swallow and a hard piece of meat to chew on. But I think that's the issue that arises with Joash. Yeah, Miss Elizabeth. Yeah. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Because I've seen the same things that you've seen. So yeah, good one. Any others? Huh? Yeah, that's true. And he respected Jehoiada's guidance. Maybe, I don't know the ages of everybody. I think that he also respected those princes that led him into idolatry. But but yeah, I think that's a very very worthy note to make. All right, they're roaring out there, so I'll quit. Thanks, everybody. I think everybody has made it back over. There might be a few more trickling in. If you want to, go ahead and mark the song number 567, 567. That'll be the song of invitation this evening for our sick list. It's pretty extensive. Please bear with me. All of these have been added very recently. So Johnny Combs is back at home and is improving. He is also fallen recently since his surgery, and so dealing with both recovering from surgery and broken bones. So keep him in our prayers. Ashley Schaus, her surgery was postponed, so we'll keep them in our prayers. Robert Fields is still in Macon Community Hospital. He's been there since yesterday evening. They were running this morning a lot of different tests to try and find out exactly what it was that caused him to pass out and fall. And so hopefully they have some answers for him here soon. Elizabeth Hoffman is in Gallatin Hospital with a bad infection. Eddie Osbrooks, that's Melinda Sewell's son-in-law's brother, has cancer treatments that are not working. Martha Doss is with her shoulder pain, is having an MRI tomorrow. Alma Clark, that's the sister of Roxy Sutton, has thyroid cancer. Christopher Nichols, that's Janice Nichols' grandson, has been diagnosed with cancer. And then we want to extend sympathy to the following families. The family of Kermis West, that is Larry West's father. The family of Robbie Jones, her service is on tomorrow. Visitation is tomorrow, Thursday, from 4 to 8, and the funeral service is Friday at 1 p.m. That'll be in Gainsboro at Anderson's Funeral Home. Also, the sympathy to the family of Scott Gann and sympathy to the family of Caleb Clark. His visitation will be tomorrow from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. and then Friday from 9 a.m. until the time of the service at Anderson's. Okay, up and coming, a few things event-wise for you. A big one is tomorrow. There is the food being bought for the Christmas gifts at Save-A-Lot. If you want to ride the church van to be a part of that food buying process, is that just for the youth? Is that just young people do that? Or is that for everybody? Anybody that wants to do it can come and help buy and organize and distribute food. So tomorrow evening, 5:45 here, if you want to ride the bus. 5 o'clock if you just want to meet at Save-A-Lot. So there is that one. Then we also have the Elf Tree pickup will be this Friday from 8 to 12. See Juanita if you want to help with those distributions in any way. The Mary mug, just the Mary mix-up. I guess if you want to buy a mug, you can. But the Mary mix-up will be after evening services this Sunday night. We'll split up into 3 different groups. There will be one group of children that will be all of the ones under 5th and under. We'll have a Mary mix-up. Then the women will be 6th and up. Buy a Christmas gift is what I have been told. So that's pretty free range. Could be decor, could be whatever. Then men, you have even more free range. Just buy a gift. Like, you're doing good if you remember to bring a gift. So men 6th and up will also have a group. Roughly keep it around $15. Don't go too crazy. So that'll be Sunday night after services, I believe. Friday men's class at 10 a.m. I believe that's everything for the adults. For the youths, we have tomorrow evening, the Jaywalkers will have a movie night at Lafayette Cinema, and that will be at 6 o'clock, and they will be watching the Polar Express. So all Jaywalkers be there. I think that's everything pressing, except for the Classic Christian Servants have a quick announcement, and this applies for anybody, though. They just have set this in motion. With the holiday season, there's a lot of busyness on our part, leading to maybe some overlook or neglect for those that are lonely or sick or hurting or shut in. And so there have been some Christmas gift bags prepared for anybody that has been maybe unable to be at worship with us, or that is shut in or confined at home or in assisted living. And so please consider grabbing one of those gift bags. They are in the foyer. They already have names and addresses on them. So the quicker you get back there, the quicker you can pick the person that you get to deliver to. But maybe even more importantly than giving them that gift is just taking a few minutes to spend time with them and talk with them and love on them. And that is, as the note says, the gift that money cannot buy. So those bags are in the foyer with names and addresses on them. Thank you in advance, CCS. Did I forget anything? Potatoes. I forgot the potatoes. So this week's what will we be giving away is bags of potatoes. So if you have a need for a 10-pound bag of potatoes, please go to Philip's vehicle. He's going to try and lure you in with 20 10-pound bags of potatoes. So see him after service if you have any interest in any of those or know anybody that could use any of those. Song of Invitation, 567, and I will turn it over to Nick.
Good evening. Well, that was depressing. Good evening. There we go. Now I'm not scared. Okay. Something I want to talk about tonight. Start off with a question. How many of us enjoy going through something hard in life, going through a hard time or a challenge? Hopefully none of you raised your hand because you're normal. But if you didn't, more power to you. But like me and about everybody in here, you don't enjoy going through things hard. You try and find any way possible to make your life easier. Think about anything you have in your home. It makes your life easier, makes something quicker. We as humans try to find the easiest way to do something in our life, but what happens when there's a situation in our life that we didn't see coming, and it's something that we can't avoid? What do you do? Where do you run when you run into something like that? Could be you lose your job. Could be a death in the family. Could be a loved one, does something completely irrational, is embarrassment, whatever, does something that you find sinful, whatever, something that you weren't prepared for that's thrown in your face. What do you do? Where do you run? Who do you look to? I was watching today, many of you know I teach, and it's finals week at the high school, so I saw all of one student who had to take their final because I gave mine early because I'm lazy, I guess. But so when I'm sitting there in my empty classroom, I was watching videos, and this video that popped up, it was Duke women's basketball coach, what's her name, Kara Lawson. She was, I guess, talking to her team or something after a practice, and what she led with was handle hard better. Talking about trials that those college girls are going through, could be classes, many times, and you might find yourself saying this, man, if I just get through this, it'll be so much better. Man, if I can pass this class, life will be a lot easier. Man, if I go to this job and I get this promotion, life will be so much better. I'll have so much more money to give to my kids and give to my wife to spend it for me, whatever, okay? Something. If only this would happen, life would be easier. What she ends up saying in the video, it's like you keep telling yourself, man, I can't wait for it to get easier, can't wait for it to get easier, when in fact, life doesn't get easier. Many of you who especially, you're older than me, my age or older, life never gets easier. Doesn't matter what happens. But what she said is you learn to handle hard better. Okay, something I tell, I coach, and something I tell my players is get comfortable being uncomfortable. Because I coach a sport where you run, if you play the full game, you're running 5 to 7 miles in a game. And they're complaining right now. I was having them run 2 miles, and they were complaining. And I would just tell them, get comfortable being uncomfortable. How many of us have that approach to life? You don't like being uncomfortable. You want to avoid it. What's something you run to? If you want to, flip over to James chapter 1. It's a kind of a classic that many of you have read probably a million times. But when life becomes challenging, we must put our faith in God instead of complaining about where we are. If you want to, James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. When life becomes hard again, where do you run? Do you run to something to take your mind off it? Do you run to a family member? Do you run to your buddies? Or do you run to God? Is that something that you find yourself challenged to do, is to ask, get the pride out of the way, say, God, I need your help with this. I need your help getting me through this tough time. I need your help getting me through this death in the family, through this job layoff, through whatever. God, can you help me through it? God at all times, he's waiting for us to ask him for help. He's a great shepherd that'll lead us through all of these trials. He's the one who will help us handle hard better, like that coach was talking about. Life doesn't ever get easier. Again, like I said, people who are older than me, I'm not old at all, even though my students and players think I'm in my 40s. Not that old at all, but life doesn't ever get easier. You learn to handle hard better, and you do that by reaching out and asking God for help. Psalm 23, y'all, again, I've read 1,000,000 times. That is a perfect illustration for what you need to do in your life. So if you find yourself struggling, if you find yourself needing help, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.
There's a great day coming, a great
Being together. I look forward to being back together on Sunday. We will finish up our series on Hosea, looking at God's redeeming love. And if there is not anything else, do we have a tribute this evening? Cole, good to go. Do you mind closing us out in closing prayer? Colton, do you mind closing us out in prayer? I was close.
Lord, thank you for what you give us now for us. Will you please be with everybody that lost their loved ones here lately? Please let everyone have a good drive home. Thank you for what you've given us done for us. Amen.